Good morning and welcome to the third international conference organized by ADRI. Yesterday, the first day of the conference, saw 6 Silver Jubilee lectures delivered by scholars discussing Bihar and Jharkhand. Shared history to shared vision. The inaugural speech was delivered by the Honorable President of India and attended by various other esteemed guests. Today, we start with the 7th lecture in the series, which will be delivered by Vinita Damodaran, Professor, University of Sussex, Brighton, and chaired by Gopa Sabharwal, Founder, Vice-Chancellor, Nalanda University, Rajgir. The topic for this lecture is Adivasis and the Anthropocene towards an environmental history of Eastern India. This will be a 40-minute lecture followed by 10 minutes for question and answer. May I please request the chair to take over the proceedings and the chair and the speaker to come on the stage. Can I also request you all to please put your phones on silent? Thank you.
Is this working? Yeah. Morning, everybody. My pleasure to be chairing the talk for Vinita Damodaran. And before I do that, I thought I'll also remind everybody that, since this is the third of the ADRI seminars, we are functioning. This is for all people who are going to chair talks and sessions. We were following the general guidelines that were set up at the first conference by the Lord Meghnad Desai, which was essentially that the chairs are supposed to keep their comments brief and keep proceedings going. So I hope everybody will take note of that, because as we do know that we have quite a tight schedule. So I'm going to be following that guideline. Coming back to our speaker this morning, Vinita Damodaran is the chair of South Asian History at the University of Sussex, and her work is very wide-ranging, very well-known, essentially focusing on the social and political history of Bihar and the environmental history of South Asia. Her book on Bihar, published in 1993, was called Broken Promises. She has 5 other books, including Nature in the Orient, the environmental history of South and Southeast Asia. Her forthcoming book is titled, it's an edited book titled Climate Change and the Humanities. She also serves as the director of the Center for World Environmental History, which is a university center of excellence dedicated to the Global South. Without much ado, I will now hand over to Vinita for her lecture titled Adivasis and the Anthropocene Towards an Environmental History of Eastern India. You have 35 minutes, yeah?
Thank you, Gopa. Could I start by just thanking Professor Sabharwal Gupta, Katika Kerpol, and other members of ADRI for their wonderful organization and for their invitation to this very important conference. It's also wonderful to see so many old friends and old faces. Of course, Arvind Narayan Das was an old friend, and I seriously miss him at this time. I was last here in Patna for a conference entitled Bihar and the World in Bihar. So it is, I must say, a very reminiscent period for me. So this paper is, its title is on the Adivasis and the Anthropocene Towards an Environmental History of Eastern India. So I'll proceed without ado to read parts of the paper and perhaps speak to my PowerPoint. I've got lots of it on slide just because I did not know how much, what the audience would be like. So forgive me if I'm preaching to the converted. Traveling to the mining town of Normundi in Jharkhand, India in 2013, I was struck by the presence of red oxide dust everywhere. On my clothes, on houses, on people, on the once brightly painted advertisement for the Tata company, noting that it was a company who valued its corporate social responsibility. As one newspaper report put it, mine areas often have a monochromatic appearance. Coal mining areas are depressingly black. Iron ore towns are red. Ochre lends a yellow color, and limestone makes everything chalky white. Fine particles of ore spread as a uniform layer of dust on every available surface in these areas. The pervasiveness of dust is the strongest indication that mining is not a benign activity. Unless carefully planned, it can barren the land for people who live and work in its vicinity. Modern technology has enormously magnified our ability to extract minerals. In the process, it has also gravely threatened human lives and the environment. Normandy in particular has been devastated by decades of mining. It's been one of the long centers of the mining industry since the early part of the 20th century. Above the local town with its withered trees and red oxide dust was the officers' colony with its bungalows and its tennis courts and its magnificent views of the reserved sal forest of Saranda, whose proportions set in the colonial period was rapidly eroding under pressure of development following the cleansing of the Maoists in the region. This was a forest extremely important in biodiversity and cultural terms, both for local communities, Indian scientists, and the Indian imaginary. Not only is it part of the cultural world of Adivasi communities, but it fueled the imagination of Bengali intellectuals, such as Vibhuti Bhushan Bandyopadhyay, who wrote Aranyak around it, not on it, but around it. In 2005, when I visited Saranda, and an earlier visit, they were making a bid. It was part of the core elephant reserve, and was in a bid for World Heritage status by the Ministry of Forests. The World Wildlife Fund was also very interested in this status and was trying to push it. As we know, Saranda later became a Maoist stronghold in the long fight between disaffected intellectuals, local communities in the state over the rights to resources, and the growing poverty and inequality in the region. Following the purging of Maoists in the region, the Saranda Development Plan sought to hasten the carving up of the reserve into mining leases. The above picture of Saranda is part of the story of Eastern India's rapid transformation in the colonial and post-colonial period, and the resistance to this by local indigenous communities and the political groupings such as the Maoists. I had been studying the region for many years, first as a historian of Bihar, where I wrote my book, Broken Promises, and then as a historian of India's Adivasi communities in Chota Nagpur and then later Jharkhand. The history of tribal communities was also an environmental history, both green and brown, of Eastern India, of a sacred 1830s landscape, gradually despoiled since 1800, reserved and protected by British colonial policy, marked by indigenous resistance and state violence, most notably, as I said, in the 1830s, 1890s, and most recently, I think there was a very important turning point in 2006, resulting in the killing of 12 tribals, as we know, in Kalinganagar, and the ongoing war in Eastern India today. So this was going on in 80 districts, as we know, and in his new book, Endless Cry in the Red Corridor, Gladson Dungdung, the Adivasi human rights activist, brilliantly and carefully documents the story of this war in two states, in Chhattisgarh and Jharkhand. It makes for compelling reading. The rape of India's resources in the name of development is paralleled by the rape of Adivasi and Dalit women. the torture, imprisonment, and extrajudicial killings of innocent civilians on an unimaginable scale. As Eastern India disintegrates, this war between a lawless state, a violent Maoist splinter groups, and security forces manifests itself in fake Naxal surrenders, the arming of local Adivasi men, massive corruption at all levels of government, and suppression of all legitimate forms of protest. In this 70th year of Indian independence, the world's largest democracy has a lot to be worried and uncomfortable about. Mapping this story was an environmental history of globalization in the region, a history which has resonances with recent debates on the Anthropocene. So in this presentation, what I'm going to be doing is looking at the complexity of human-environment interactions by focusing on these communities and their intimate ecologies. For environmental historians, the recent discovery of the Anthropocene comes as a surprise. After all, the concept of human-induced environmental and human nature interactions over time has been a core object of our study. The Denal School had since the 1950s elaborated the role of geography and climate in history over long time frames. In 2005, the Darlem Workshop brought an interdisciplinary group of social scientists and historians. The group included two historians, Richard Grove and John McNeill, sociologists and scientists, including Paul Crutzen, who coined the word the Anthropocene, on a project to integrate socio-economic environmental interactions over centennial timescales. And the project was, of course, called the Integrated History and Future of People on Earth, the IHOPE project. And the first volume was edited by Robert Constanzas, Lisa Graumelt, and Will Stephan. So for Earth system scientists, the mapping of anthropogenic climate change has led them to see humans as a geological force, transforming the Earth's atmosphere and allowing them to designate the last few centuries as the Anthropocene. The period has no precise start date, but based on atmospheric evidence, may be considered to start from the Industrial Revolution of the 18th century, and include, for example, the period of great acceleration, which coincides with the rise of fossil fuel use after the Second World War. A recent article in Nature using GSSP, the Global Stratitype section and point markers notes, that agreeing to a start date related to the Industrial Revolution may be used to assign historical responsibility for CO2 emissions to particular countries or regions. Though interestingly, the article also goes on to note the dip in CO2 emissions in 1610, linked to population decline in the Americas from 60 million in 1492 to 6 million in 1650, via diseases carried by Europe, plus war, enslavement, and famine. And I suppose we could use an agreement, we could agree that using evidence of irreversible change for a period of 1800 and accelerating fossil fuel use since 1945 as a period of when the global carbon dioxide peaked. And I think it's useful to stick to those dates for our purposes today. Scientists such as Sverker Sollerin has noted, and scientists, as Sverker Sollerin has noted, are described as the historians of the future. By ceding the terrain of history to scientists in this debate on the Anthropocene, and foregrounding big planetary narratives on the fate of humanity, one can argue that locality, class, gender, and race risk being glossed over. We, the humanities and historians, need to reclaim our terrain and to foreground questions of locality, race, and class. So what I'm trying to do in this presentation is to look at the impact of global climate and environmental change by using a pointillist approach and looking at the impact, particularly, as I said, in particular locales, and here in this case, the impact of what I call globalization from below on Adivasi communities in India and their landscapes. So in doing so, what this presentation is attempting to do is to challenge planetary debates by earth scientists through historical and political engagement with capitalism, democracy, and resource extraction, and to focus on communities in particular periods and specific places in the global south. The shifting politics of the climate change debate today, from historical responsibility to we are all in it together, calls for a radical new political imagination to deal with resource wars, the militarization of borders and boundaries, and problematic ideas of top-down stewardship of landscape and forest regimes. So in some ways, what one is trying to do here is to rescue a good Anthropocene from a bad Anthropocene. Mike Hugh, the well-known climate scientist, has noted that the positivist disciplines are ill-suited to engaging with and articulating the deeper human search for values, purpose, and meaning. Yet this search is exactly where humanity's new entanglement with global climate is taking us. To shed new light on multiple meanings of climate change in diverse cultures, and to create new entry points for policy innovation, the interpretative social sciences, arts, and humanities need new spaces for meeting as equals with the positivist sciences. So the framing of these debates, as I said, have to be understood in terms of current global political economy and geopolitics. And we need to, of course, in this context, revisit the idea of sustainable development and the Anthropocene. In a recent article in Nature, Greeks has redefined this as development that meets the needs of the present while safeguarding Earth's life support system on which the welfare of current and future generations depend. It has also been argued that discounting the future and valuing the present is much easier to do in materially poor societies in the global south, where survival itself is at stake. But this argument is certainly not true for indigenous societies in eastern India, where attitudes towards the environment are very different, are intergenerational and conservationist. These are communities whose values and ways of coexisting with nature in the past help us learn useful lessons. Anthropologists such as Marshall Salins and more recently James Clifford have argued and have written persuasively about cultures and about the decentering of the West. As Clifford notes in his book Returns in 2013, which documents indigenous histories of survival. Let me see if I can find that quote. And he's sort of written this in a very interesting book called Returns. He says, the inability, documenting indigenous histories of survival, struggle, and renewal, show the inability of neoliberal ideology to subsume alternatives, to round up and account for everyone, and makes it easier to imagine new identities, social struggles, and kinds of conviviality. For indigenous communities, he argues, reaching back selectively to deeply rooted adaptive traditions creates new pathways in a complex postmodernity. Research that explores the environmental history and anthropology of particular communities and localities will help uncover what Mike Hume has called alternative ways of living on this earth, detail the impact of the Anthropocene on the locality, and allow us to reimagine how we live. Furthermore, a focus on the locality will allow us to show the local impacts of global processes and the ways in which the impact of anthropogenic environmental change has a particularly devastating effect in specific locales and on specific communities. This has particular relevance in the light of recent discussions on resilience. The debate on the Anthropocene is wrapped up with ideas of resilience. And with security. But we need to examine how people have historically understood resilience, the ways in which resilience is mediated, and on the ways in which community and place shapes resilience. everyday forms of resilience through human agency, collective action, and knowledge is critical to resilience thinking. And in the context of Eastern Indian Adivasis, seeing resistance and resilience as synonyms, I think is important. Studies of environmental resistance movements in India has shown how people have historically challenged social processes and built alternatives to capitalist imperatives, and more recently the neoliberal perspectives of a corporate state. For current day developmental specialists working on resilience thinking, I would argue that resilience can be recuperated through resistance. As historians, we can bring the power politics back to Anthropocene and resilience thinking by focusing on agency and power and resilience science. Through studying the locality and place in the long time frame, we can offer examples of good resilience and bad resilience, which range from resilience, for example, in the aftermath of the New Orleans disaster, to fishing communities in the Philippines, to Mexico, to Bolivia, and Eastern India, where it has been documented that communities less engaged with the market were more resilient to climate vulnerability. So much of this study which I'm doing is located within South Asian environmental history, which has its roots in, and we've documented this, Richard Grove and I documented this in an article in EPW some years ago, which has its roots in Jean Filiosa's work on South India as a regional study, and was born out of Filiosa's interest in the environmental history in the 1950s. And you have other contributors to environmental history. There was E.K. Janaki-Ammal in the 1950s who contributed to a landmark volume in environmental history and historical geography, which has gone unrecognized. As a leading botanist and author of the Chromosome Atlas of Cultivated Plants, she was the only woman and the only non-white contributor to the Chicago meeting by W.L. Thomas on man's role in changing the face of the earth. So these were, I would say, precursors to South Asian environmental history. And regional and local histories of South Asia was initiated in this pioneering volume by Richard Sandman and myself, which we edited, Nature and the Orient to the Environmental History of South and Southeast Asia. A series of regional histories that emerged with Mahesh Rangarajan, Rohan D'Souza, Vasant Sabharwal, and Keshava Ramakrishnan, whose work described the colonial watershed movement in the forest and water history of central India and Orissa, and examined colonial constructions of nature and the creation of the boundaries of forests, wasteland, and partitioning of landscapes. So when you move on to the mapping of the environmental history of Eastern India, there's been interesting work that some of us have done on the empirical aspects of deforestation, state and forest control, dam building, mining, land tenure ownership relations, and conservation impacts. There's been studies, of course, notably by Sanjukta Das-Gupta and so on, who have looked at resistance movements and looked at land tenure in particular in Eastern India. But there's still many gaps, and I would invite young scholars to start working on getting the data on climate change and extreme events, vegetation histories. The only vegetation history we have for the region is the 1989 project to 91 project by John F. Richards and Elizabeth Flint. There's no vegetation or climate stock history. Water availability, pollution data, animal and human conflicts, disease histories, all these are still very, very open for exploration and research. Because there's also new actors in environmental governance space, corporate companies, NGOs, activists, and politicians, as we know, which could be researched on. And issues of law and structural justice in terms of reparations even. I'm coming back from a conference in Onati in Spain, where Aboriginal communities in Australia were represented by lawyers talking about reparations. So there is a lot that we can begin to be thinking about in terms of structural justice issues. So what I've done in this paper, and I'll now rapidly go through the remaining slides which I have, is look at, is see how the impact of this, what I call globalization from below, in terms of the Adivasis of Eastern India, maps onto the current definitions of the Anthropocene in terms of what happens between 1800 and 1947, what happens post-1947, and what happens post-1991. and of course post-2000. And so looking at it in these three phases, I think allows us to map it to these sort of more planetary debates on the Anthropocene, and I think it really fits in very well with the longer durée of environmental change and its impact on local communities. So the research was, of course, started in Chotanagpur, which was then called Chotanagpur, an area of as we know, 44,000 square miles, known as Jharkhand, populated by 33 different tribes, including the Mundas, Hos, Orans, and Santals. I've written a paper on the importance of wild food resources in the region in the past. And I've also sort of challenged the sort of revisionist accounts by a lot of anthropologists and historians who talk about the overeating of the lands, overeating of the forest relationship of these communities, which I've called revisionist reader, and I've sort of written against it, and I won't reiterate much of my old work there, but just to note that the colonial accounts are quite interesting, and they quite clearly understood local historical and ecological realities. And Shiva Ramakrishnan, the well-known historian of forests, notes that the perceptions of ecological differences between the moist sal forests of North Bengal, the dry deciduous forests of Chotanagpur, and the mangrove swarms of the Sundarbans, coupled with the different lifestyles of communities inhabiting these regions, resulted in different regimes of colonial governance. So the local ecological and historical setting was clearly written up by these colonial administrators. And you can't really completely accuse them of inventing these differences. And this was also, of course, a period of rapid deforestation that the colonial state was engaged in, its own pursuit of land and forests. And this is, again, a history that we all know. But the response, I think, is very interesting. The extensive deforestation in the region resulted in and in India more largely resulted in the setting up of colonial forest reserves, where 1/6 of India's land was declared as forest reserves under the 1878 Forest Act. And the response to this, in terms of the effect on these communities who already had been affected by deforestation on a scale which was unimaginable, was the Chotanagpur Tenancy Act of 1908. And the regulations that the colonial state introduced, I think, was quite interesting. They were able to soften and alleviate the results, and perhaps challenge some of the more difficult ways in which these communities were being dealt with under the state. And I think these regimes of governance, I think Arun Agarwal has written very extensively and interestingly on the regime of governance in Kumaon. And I think one needs to understand this in terms of the way in which legislation was made to favor local rights in the context of the draconian forest reservations of the 1880s. Of course, there was continued resistance against these forest legislations. Birsa Munda's movement is quite well known. The main focus of Birsa's discontent were the restrictions regarding the protected forests of Porahat and Piring. The measures taken to mark off village forests and to prepare a record of forest rights caused much unrest in the region. Petitions were submitted by various monkeys and so on. So common rights and custom become an issue around which a lot of the conflict is. And this is a very interesting quote by Father Hoffman on the CNTA. For more than 100 years, the Mundas were calumniated as savages or semi-savages, whose claims were too exorbitant and absurd to be listened to, as stubborn rebels whom nobody could satisfy and therefore justly subjected to severe military reprisals, as the Coles who were fit for nothing, but carrying burdens and being serfs. And now, after a cruel martyrdom that has lasted all too long, Their claims have been recognized officially as having been perfectly right, and their land system appears as one of the wisest creations of prehistoric times. So after all, they're neither savages nor semi-savages, but a race of martyrs, most deserving of the sympathy and respect of all right-minded men. Therefore, they act as a justification and rehabilitation of the highest moral value. And this is the sort of thinking that goes on to the debates in the Statutory Commission later on in the 1930s, the debates around the Government of India Act, where you get the special provision being made for these communities under the backward tracts regulations. Their contentment does not depend so much on the rapid political advance as on experience in sympathetic handling and on protection from economic subjugation by their neighbors. So since 47, of course, this story is, and I was very interested when yesterday Wendy was talking, the decade of the 1950s, which she saw as this optimal moment, is when the worst, terrible environmental destruction was happening. So it was a decade of environmental destruction, and I would like to know how this sort of pans out in the legislative debates, and her wonderful paper which she sort of presented yesterday, and that was the question I was going to ask her. So post-1945, you're getting this huge displacement. You can 5 million people displaced. And of course, the tyranny of developmentalism is challenged by the parties in the 1960s and 70s, the Birsa Seva Dal, the Bihar Prant Hul, the Jharkhand parties, and the Jharkhand JMM, as we know. And since 1991, what do we see? We see this Klondike mining rush. The inland areas of Jharkhand and Western Orissa can be considered a colony of the coast. Many of these 20 mountain ranges planned for exploitation and extension of mining, 100% FDI in 2006, feeding the world's insatiable appetite has turned large tracts of forest into waste in Jharkhand. The environmental consequences of coal and iron ore mining over the Longitude, I don't need to tell you. Pollution of rivers, soil erosion, deforestation in Singhbhum and Sundargarh, the pollution effects of iron ore mining, abundant processing of ore generating slimes and fine ores. Pollution of the Damodar, water and air. Impact on forests and wildlife, mining of tailing disposal, the biggest threat to elephant conservation. An image of Saranda, which I took some years ago. It's interesting that this data, I think, is 50% of the mining areas are involved in conflict. Saranda is crisscrossed currently with mining leases. Mittal companies have been given clearance for another project in Saranda last year, and 2 projects on the pipeline. Of the 86,000 hectares, 1,100 hectares with 40% canopy are under mining leases. This was, as I said, the turning point when people who were protesting were killed. We know about the resistance in Niamgiri and the Dongria Khons. Now, these are my concluding slides. So the fact of newly privatized natures resoundingly demonstrates that enclosure is alive and well in the 21st century. The question that needs to be answered is that given the history, politics, and social embeddedness, and I'll ask all the political scientists here to tell me why this is happening, of institutions of state and civil society, how and why is it being allowed to such wide neoliberal enclosures proceed, representing so few people's interests to proceed? So post-colonial challenges, land is the bulwark of Aboriginal life, equality sounds good, but I do demand discrimination when it comes to Aboriginal land, Chairperson saying in 1949. To protect the environment, to safeguard the forests and wildlife of the country, and to protect and improve the natural environment, including forests, lakes, rivers, and wildlife, and to have compassion for living creatures, the Constitution of India, 1950. Indigenous activism uses international discourse on tangible and intangible heritage, challenge neoliberal discourses. And the mapping of the story in these brilliantly documented recent books by Gladson, Mission Saranda, and the War and the Cry in the Red Corridor. There are comparative campaigns going on in Ecuador and so on, where the Yasuni ITT initiative, which is quite, I think, which is useful. Do we need to mine everywhere? Should there be no-go areas? It was an unprecedented victory for the environmental community as the first large-scale carbon abatement project carried out by the developing country with cooperation from the international community. But it sadly didn't survive. Yeah. So conclusions. What the climate change debate has revealed so far is that inequalities, patterns of domination and exploitation are thrown anew into stark relief. Dipesh Chakrabarty has noted that the debate on the Anthropocene underlines the need for a radically different kind of politics. How do we construct this new kind of emancipatory politics? I argue in the paper that implicit in this politics is the relationship between capital and community, and a critique of capital by recuperating the history of community and resistance. And as Lewis and Masson note, the power that humans wield is like any other force of nature and that can be used, withdrawn, or modified. The recognition that human actions are driving far-reaching changes to the life-supporting infrastructure of the earth has philosophical, social, political, and economic implications. But it may be already too late to do very much about it all. I'm going to stop there.
Thank you very much. Questions, please? Okay. Could we have, all right, 1, 2. Peaches. Oh, you have to go to Jean Raymond first. Yeah. You'll take all 3 questions?
Yeah.
So we'll take all questions together and then Vinita can answer them. Yeah.
Thank you for an excellent presentation on a long-term process. Would you consider that your presentation can be called anti-national, going against the national interest, as has been argued not only by the current government, but also by the former government? And if so, if you agree with me, how do you think you're going to handle that? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I'll talk next, yeah.
Could I respond to this, please?
Okay, you could. Well,
It's just, we've been asked to talk about shared vision, shared history and shared vision. What I've tried to show here is a shared vision for the planet and what we can learn from a particular way of living and being in the world. So I hope that nobody sees this as anti-national, but much more inclusive and a different way of looking.
I'm sure that the current audience here would not consider this anti-national. But how do you relate to policymakers and politicians who make that claim? You're not addressing only an audience of social scientists, of social science scholars. You're also addressing politicians and policy makers who do not like to listen to the argument you have made. How are you going to handle that? How do you see that you can change the fabric of policies and politics?
Because there are these multiple debates going on in India and have historically gone on. The aggrandizing nature of the East India Company, one of the worst aggrandizing companies, was challenged by its scientists, its political lobby, by Birsa Munda. So you had checks all the time, and they were able to put into place regulatory regimes and no-go areas, which was one of the most rapacious companies in the world. Yeah. So I'm sure that the Indian government, India, which has had a history of, in some senses, respecting different traditions, this particular period is probably something that is that we will rethink, and I hope that we do rethink in terms of the ways in which different challenges come. And I think resistance thinking, the way in which the apathy which journalists are talking about now in Indian civil society and Indian is not there among these communities. So that is what one needs to recuperate for our sort of emancipatory politics. The sort of resistance that's happening in these areas, the need, what Partha Chatterjee has called the relationship between community and capital. That's where the new emancipatory politics is going to come.
Yeah. Mike, Samnidhi. Okay, so our next 2 questions are next to each other.
I'm Al Pasha from the London School of Economics, Department of Anthropology. I really appreciated your presentation and what you're broadly trying to do here. But I guess I'm very uncomfortable with this recent trend in the use of the Anthropocene. Because for me, I think I'm with Benjamin Kunkel, who wrote this brilliant piece on the Anthropocene in the LRB, the London Review of Books, about a month ago, where the argument is that to use this concept is to actually distract from what is really at issue here, which is basically capitalism and the unbridled harm that it's been causing, the ecological harm it's been causing. And by using the term Anthropocene, what we're actually doing is we're changing the political focus, because suddenly we're all responsible for what's happening to humanity and what's happening to nature, and it's a politics of the redistribution of that responsibility. Whereas in fact, the target that is actually implicit in your presentation is the nature of capitalism in Jharkhand. So I wanted to ask you about your positions in relation to this. I appreciated your turn to capital at the end of your presentation, but I think there's a real danger in joining wholeheartedly this trend of using the Anthropocene today.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I mean, I've used the term Anthropocene in terms of the ways in which it can be. Capitalocene has, of course, been another favorite word. But looking at the way in which anthropogenic environmental and climate change, opening up the concept in terms of what the planetary debate actually means in terms of the more local. Yeah, so I would certainly accept that clarification. I'm using it in a much more broader way than the limited way in which it is being suggested.
Thanks. My name is Nitya Rao from the University of Stanley School of International Development. And you made a comment, Vinita, in between about communities who are less engaged with markets, actually more resilient to climate change. And this is probably correct, but it seems to me to be, I think, following on from Alpa's point, that something which is kind of in the realm of ideology and not really this. I know that there are real consequences in terms of well-being of losing on the environment. Recently, I've been doing research in Odisha, and you see amongst tribal Adivasi communities, nutrition levels, for instance, going down over the last 30 years, and one can directly link it with decline in forests, decline in environment, and so on. However, I don't see that kind of, from a development perspective, we say that nutrition, education, health, these are very important criteria, but I don't see these as becoming points of resistance and emancipatory politics on the ground. Rather, people seem to be buying into the capitalist discourse of wanting money, more private schools, more private education, and so on. So I'm not sure how you see, in terms of your final concluding comment of emancipatory politics, how is it going to actually link to these sort of very insidious forces of capitalism which are entering into tribal communities?
Yeah, no, I mean, what I'm suggesting once again is a sort of, I would not disagree with you. It is about a landscape which is being eroded. It's about a landscape where a particular sort of lifestyle cannot be sustained anymore, because I've written extensively on wild food resources and the ways in which it did provide, the mahua flower and so on, did provide a particular way of life. But what you're getting now is the developmental challenges, and you as a developmental anthropologist would know this much better than me, is enormous. And particularly tied to climate change. So the disease etiologies, the whitefly in Jharkhand and so on, the changing monsoon, the fact that they cannot predict anything, creeping uncertainty, is all part of climate change, or is all part of the way in which we are using the system. And these people have talked about it, have known about it. So it's interlinked. So I suppose what I'm suggesting is restoring a balance, an ecological balance, would mean that you could then restore. And it's about social structure as well. When you're pushing them to coal mines, crime. It's about the resilience in every sense. It's about community. It's about social structure. It's about destruction of particular ways of living and being. I mean, you could turn them into Australian Aboriginals if you want, whose social structure is completely destroyed and are shown endlessly on television. I mean, the group that I met in Onati were all talking about irreparable harm and structural justice. And we don't hear that here. We don't hear the word structural justice. Yes.
Where are we? Yeah, since we are nearly, I mean, we have 2 minutes, so I'll allow one more question. Yeah.
Yes. Marine Carin, University of Toulouse. Thank you for this impressive presentation, Vinita. I am reading a Glasgow Dung Dung book, Mission Zaranda, and looking at my own experience in Japan these last decades, I am wondering, we have many data on forest declining, change of food, condition of the Adivasis, etc. But we lack really measurement and documentation of industrial pollution. I mean, regarding mines, we need some history. I know the book of Felix Padel on aluminium, but what we would need perhaps is a more precise history of industrial pollution to be able to map out exactly the problem and the threat of the global warming and climate change.
No, I would totally agree with you, Gauri. I mentioned carbon stock history and vegetation history and the gaps in Eastern India's environmental history, which include pollution histories. What we're trying to do at Sussex is to prepare a famine series, extreme event series, and we are sort of building up a database from 1700 through the historical archive. But we haven't got to the 20th century yet. We are still in the 18th century.
Okay, since I did say yes to Professor Nirmal Sengupta, I'll allow him to ask his question. Sorry, Deepankar, after which there is a tea break, yeah.
It's a very interesting presentation, but just two questions. That the kind of paradigm that you are taking for development is a little closed. There is something like, say, Convention on Biodiversity is proposing that you value this knowledge for integration. And Niyamgiri Hills practically has been resolved out. I was reading the court case. The judge has raised the CBD question, and out of that, the reservation plus 20% of royalty for the local people, etc., has been given. What they have done is they have modified to extend to genetic variety preservation. The other setup is this World Intellectual Property Organization has taken up issues like quickly, you take this Australian Aboriginal case. Now their designs, etc., are now giving them the survival avenue. So won't they be able to find out these alternative things as instead of going into this old particular ways?
So the question is whether you're talking about intellectual property here. Nirmalji? Yeah.
No, I say that the survival part is having alternative avenues today. The tribal communities also are getting into a different set of globalization. How do you look at it? Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, this is not to sort of romanticize what's happening there. There's lots of very, very. The whole paper was is engaged or mired in the politics of the period. So, as I'm a historian, we now know that the politics of Adivasiness is also a lot of it is invented in the 20th century, 21st century politics. So what I'm building on is a sort of memory of a culture, memory of tradition the ways in which alternative ways of living and being are being reproduced and in the 21st century. That's all I'm trying to do without really trying to romanticize these groups in any way.
So we're out of time with that. I think Vinita, big round of applause. You want me to make the housekeeping announcement, or are you making it? So what do we have? A 15-minute tea break, after which we meet back in this room. Yes? Okay. We meet at the tea is at the back of the room, is it? I can't see any tea there. Okay, it's in the next room. Yeah. There is tea there? Okay, only to the back of the hall. So you don't leave the confines of this room. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Vinita. Thank you.